Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the War for BADAB, where the Red Scorpions, Chapter Master Carcharodons, Lord Militant of the Loyalist Forces in the Autonomous Zone, is looking around for a job that he can assign to the newly arrived Carcharodon chapter. The Fire Angel's description of the newcomers had left him somewhat worried, to put it mildly. There was also the fact that Legate Inquisitor John Dice Frayne appeared all too happy to welcome them. Best to keep them as far out of the way as possible then, but the battlefield was shrinking rapidly, and the only way you could keep them out of the Red Scorpion's path was to send them to the Endymion cluster and the ongoing Tranquility campaign against the Mantis warriors. It seemed almost cruel to let such a violent chapter loose on the Mantis warriors, who had up until this point been acting with considerable honor, but better they be the enemy's problem than the Red Scorpions' problem. But the Mantis warriors were not really in the best of shapes to be receiving visitors, particularly not of this kind. The last few years had been harsh to the green-armored sons of the Khan. Ever since they'd sided with Lufthuron, things had been going steadily downwards for the Mantis warriors. The death of their chapter master, Yarvan Sartak, during the Betrayal of Grief, was the first moment at which point they started to realize maybe this was the wrong side. It was, of course, by then, far too late. The Mantis warriors had sided vociferously with the Astral Claws, in the face of the Administratum's ever more blatant disregard for the needs of the Warder's chapters. And the Mantis warriors were the very first secessionist forces to actively fire upon what would become the Loyalist chapters, the Fire Angels. Though, to be fair, the Fire Angels were hardly blameless for that particular confrontation either. Nevertheless, the sign had most assuredly been selected, though when the inquisitorial delegates arrived asking for samples of their gene seed, the Mantis warriors may have seen at least some opportunity to help their image, shall we say, as they did give gene seed samples to the inquisitorial adjutants, though they did not go so far as to allow them access to their secret base for, again, other obvious reasons. But beyond such actions, the war still continued. The Mantis warriors had been able to fight on their home turf of the Endymion cluster now for the last year or so, where they had successfully fended off the attempts of the Fire Angels to penetrate deep into the Endymion cluster, and the occasional, somewhat half-hearted attempts by the Sons of Medusa to do the same. The Sons in particular, mind you, also backed up by Imperial Guard and Inquisitorial Stormtrooper regiments. Whereas the Fire Angels found themselves with somewhat more limited aid. But, reinforcements or not, neither chapters were making much in the way of inroads. Much has already been said about the Mantis warriors' familiarity with the Endymion cluster, and they were using it to the absolute greatest degree possible. Lord Commander Carcharodons had already been considering how to deal with the Endymion cluster for quite some time. He would either need to assign further chapters or Imperial Guard and Navy resources to the front, or simply try to contain it whilst dealing with the BADAB system. The problem was, if the Endymion cluster could not be cracked, how could he ever hope to take on the far more heavily entrenched BADAB system? And the convenient arrival of the Carcharodons had provided him with a handy-dandy way of breaking the impasse. They could be immediately rerouted to the Endymion cluster without compromising any ongoing deployments, and without needing to draw off any of Carcharodons' more trusted chapters from the BADAB front. Furthermore, if they succeeded, yay! If they failed, less inquisitorial influence. Win, win. At least for everyone that wasn't green. And the Carcharodons wasted no time leaving their own unique mark on the Tranquility campaign, choosing the cigar system as their very first target. It was a fairly wealthy and resourceful system that had been more or less ignored by the Mantis warriors and the Fire Angels, presumably in the hope of seizing it intact once the Mantis warriors had been dealt with. The Carcharodons, however, had no such long-term views on the conflict, and blasted through the system like a pack of sharks, ripping, tearing, destroying, and gobbling down anything and everything in their way. The colonies, the ships, the asteroid citadels, all of it. What had taken millennia to build, and which had blossomed into its own unique civilization, with hundreds of small, independent clan-like structures that all unified in an overarching organization to provide the Endymion cluster with rich bounties of the Counter's asteroid fields, was all wiped out in a couple of weeks. Only bothering to inform Vengeance Station and Loyalist Command after the fact. An Imperial Navy scout vessel, the Resplendent Martyr, which was sent in to estimate the effect of the Carcharodons' assault, could report that nothing was alive in the system, nor was anything left intact. And it wasn't just the devastation that raised eyebrows, it was also what was missing. This had been a major resource-producing area, where the various clans had been drawing various rare minerals from the uncountable asteroid belts that had accumulated in this particular place over the course of millennia. And yet all of the stores, all of the vast mineral deposits, all of the manufactured materials, all of it had disappeared. And not destroyed, there was little to no sign of it in the wreckage, and so the only conclusion could be that the Carcharodons had taken it all. The Sigurd system had not merely been chosen as the freshly arrived chapter's first target simply because of the damage its loss would do to the Mantis warriors, but because after millennia spent at the absolute outer edges of the Imperium, in the near-complete darkness of the void far from the Astronomicon's beacon, the Carcharodons were low on supplies. Starving sharks set loose in an innocent civilian system with predictable consequences. And now, with their bellies stuffed and their stores restocked, the Carcharodons could move on to their first true statement in the war. A return to Iblis, the site of the great ambush of the Firehawks chapter that had seen the then loyalist naval port of Sagan fall into the secessionists' hands, forcing the Firehawks into an embarrassing, lengthy, and costly retreat from the Endymion cluster. But the world of Iblis had, as we all know, suffered heavily for its role in this grand plan as well. As the Firehawks' massive fortress monastery, the Raptorus Rex, had hung in low orbit above the planet, scorching a considerable area of its surface. But despite the devastation caused by the point-blank orbital bombardment, the Lords of Iblis still sided firmly with the Mantis warriors. This was a recurring theme throughout the Endymion cluster. They had been protected by the Mantis warriors for millennia, and had in turn supported the green-armored sons of the Khan for just as long. They would not be turned away from them so easily. The Firehawks had not been able to turn them, but the Carcharodons were convinced that they had the correct argument. You see, the error of the Firehawks was that they had not been thorough enough. Their orbital bombardment had been cut short by the necessity to flee from the Mantis warriors' encroaching fleet. The Carcharodons were not to be so easily swayed from their purpose. The feudal populace of Iblis had done their best to prepare themselves for the return of the Loyalists, as they knew their verdant, or should I say, once verdant world would undoubtedly be targeted once more, as it was a relatively large agricultural center these days. The Endymion cluster had once been a fairly prosperous area, with many sources of both materiel and foodstuffs, but with the war, the numbers of these worlds capable of maintaining steady production had declined drastically, leading in turn to an ever-rising strategic importance placed upon those that did remain. But being a mere feudal planet, Iblis had never developed much in the way of a PDF or a way to defend itself, beyond withstanding the occasional raid and predation from the Maelstrom, which even then was responded to mostly by the Mantis warriors. Nevertheless, they armed and armored themselves to the best of their capabilities, and it would prove woefully inadequate against the enemy that was now encroaching upon their borders. The Carcharodons were not like the Firehawks. They would not stand by in orbit and blast cities from high above with lance batteries or torpedo strikes. Oh no. The entirety of their chapter would descend upon a single city, a single fortification complex, the seat of a local lord or administrator, annihilating it in a display of absolute overwhelming violence and force, and then simply move on to the next target, bathing them in blood one by one by one. They were sending a message, not necessarily to the people of Iblis, though they were certainly getting the lesson as well, but mostly to the Mantis warriors. These are your people, these are your dependents, these are your charges, and you cannot protect them from us. Come try if you dare, you will find us sterner foes than the Firehawks. The Mantis warriors tried to help out Iblis in the only real way they could. They had no chance in facing yet another full-strength chapter head-on. They would like to avoid the mistake of the Lamenters if they could. Instead, they launched punitive raids against various Loyalists' planets, supply convoys, and systems nearby, hoping to draw the Carcharodons away to protect these other softer targets. The Mantis warriors had severely misjudged the nature of their foe this time around. Why, on God's good green... No, wait. Why, by God's good blue oceans, would sharks care about the suffering of the fish around them, when it already had its prey firmly between its jaws? They would continue to torture the hapless world of Iblis for weeks more. They would spend longer dealing with Iblis than they had the cigar system, taking great pains to ensure that every petty king, every bureaucratic center, every government official, every administrative hub, even down to the mercantile trade hubs of the planet, everything that could provide the scattered, shell-shocked populace with a rallying point, with something to center themselves around, was burnt, smashed, and scattered. When the Carcharodons finally tired of their brutality and left Iblis, the world was left worse off than most death worlds, with naught but obliteration left in the shadow of the grey armored Adeptus Astartes. Recovery was not the first priority of the populace of Iblis. What little remained. Avoiding extinction caused by a lack of food, shelter, and potable water were far more immediate concerns. Despite the technical failure to bring the Mantis warriors to battle, however, the Carcharodons saw absolutely no reason to change their tactics. Clearly, Iblis had simply just not been an important enough target. And so they set course for Endymion Prime, the supposed capital world of the cluster itself. Again, the Mantis warriors tried to dissuade the Carcharodons from their path, launching even more raids into the loyalist lines and attempting to pick away at the Carcharodons wherever they could find them. But resolutely they refused to be shifted from their path, until finally they arrived at their target, where they found a small group of fire angels already entrenched and fighting a guerrilla campaign not against the Mantis warriors, but instead primarily against the civilian populace of the planet, led by a handful of the Astartes. Technically speaking, the world was already under loyalist control, as the Fire Angels had taken it without much in the way of resistance, but were now bogged down in this unfolding conflict. And the Fire Angels, another honorable chapter of Carab Cullen's preference, had not been able to end the battle either, refraining from targeted retaliation operations against the civilian populace, instead trying in vain to seek out and engage military targets. And since of course they were already in technical command of the world's infrastructure and installations, the only real target they could try to seek out and destroy were the handful of Mantis warriors leading the rebellion. But trying to locate a Mantis warrior on one of their own planets is much like trying to catch the wind with a tennis racket. And whilst the Fire Angels continued their futile efforts, the Mantis warrior-led insurrection made life a living hell for the loyalists on the planet, destroying shipments of supplies, of food, and of water, forcing the Fire Angels to cut into the civilian rations, making them even more unpopular, in turn only bolstering the Mantis warriors' cause. The way things were going, the Fire Angels and the Loyalists would eventually be forced from the planet due to simple necessity. But with the arrival of the Carcharodons, the rules of engagement were about to shift drastically. For whilst the Fire Angels were just that, angels, the God Emperor's finest warriors, and the embodiment of all the best ideals of humanity, the Carcharodons were but simple predators. And the high and mighty ideals and ethics of civilized men, nothing more than inscrutable nonsense to their dead eyes. And thus it's a small wonder that when the Carcharodons arrived in orbit, they did not communicate in any way with the Fire Angels, and simply launched a full-scale orbital assault upon the planet, landing in drop pods and thunderhawks all across the surface of Endymion Prime. As you probably imagine, the sudden and violent appearance of a third party that had not announced itself to either the Fire Angels or the Mantis Warriors threw things into quite a bit of chaos. The Fire Angels themselves knew that these were supposedly loyalist forces, but they were attacking completely and utterly without any regard whatsoever to the Fire Angels or the loyalist positions, and they were themselves drawn into the combat as it blew up all across the world. Endymion Prime was a massive industrial planet, covered by all manners of infrastructure, chemical plants, and factoriums. the integrity of which the Carcharodons could apparently not care less about. Within hours, they had set ablaze several massive chemical storages, and toxic spills were spreading throughout major population centers, with no one really knowing what by the Guard Emperor's own seat was going on. Even as in the Loyalists' garrison command headquarters, the Fire Angels were gathering to assess the damages, which was already stretching in tens of thousands of civilian casualties, and wondering what they were even going to do about this. I mean, they couldn't fight the Carcharodons, surely. Did they have authorization to do this? Had they simply not been told? From whom did the orders stem? Even as this discussion was going on, the Mantis warriors made their own move. The insurrectionist and combat squads of Jagatai Khan's sons began popping up across the planet and engaging the Carcharodons openly. The targets that the Fire Angels had been chasing now for weeks and months were finally out in the open, and yet the Fire Angels kind of felt like they should be siding with the Mantis warriors instead of their supposed allies. This, of course, was the aim of the Carcharodons. This was exactly the same strategy that they had attempted to employ on Iblis. But this time, the Mantis warriors could not ignore their provocations. Endymion Prime was the de facto capital world of the cluster, and of considerable, if nothing else, moral importance to the Mantis warriors, who began sending in further combat teams, infiltrating them more and more until they were open combat in the streets between fully organized companies of Mantis warriors engaging the numerically superior Carcharodon forces. Interestingly, pointedly enough, there are very few, if any, mentions of the Fire Angels taking a direct part in this conflict, other than defending themselves from, well, both bloody parties. The Carcharodons were not gaining any friends, but that was hardly their aim either. Their objective was simply to drag the Mantis warriors down into the mud alongside them, as dozens of small-scale combat team skirmishes erupted all across the planet. The Carcharodons would be ambushed by the Mantis warriors only to rush forward in a bloodthirsty charge, ignoring their own wounded and casualties as they closed with the Mantis warriors. Locked in combat, it also made it very difficult for the Mantis warriors to disengage and withdraw, as the Carcharodons would continue to hound them meter by meter, leading to skirmishes running over the course of hours, if not days, with the Mantis warriors swiftly transforming from the ambushers, the predators, to the prey. And as the two sides stalked each other through ruined manufactorums and the hellish green glow of ruptured chemical plants, it swiftly became clear that whilst the Mantis warriors were giving as good as they got, if not indeed in many occasions better, they had been at war for half a decade. They did not have the numbers to spare, whereas the Carcharodons, recently engorged from the plunders and loot of the cigar system, they had plenty of manpower and materiel to burn, so long as it meant they got to lock teeth and claw with the Mantis warriors. The situation quickly grew so dire that Ahasra Redith, the chief librarian of the Mantis warriors and the man who had gained the title of the Dust Prophet, the man whose foresight and leadership had seen the Mantis warriors' effective defense of the Endymion cluster stand up to all challengers up until this point, he forbade any further Mantis warriors' reinforcements from being sent to Endymion Prime, realizing that he was only bleeding his troops white in the face of the Carcharodons. But even though the most respected and honorable member of the entire chapter forbade them, The Mantis warriors already on the planet refused to retreat, having seen firsthand the Carcharodons' careless slaughter of the civilian population. They were of the opinion that they were little more than chaos worshippers, wearing the Emperor's signum as a disgraceful mockery of the grand ideals of the Imperium of Man. They were, over the course of the coming months and weeks, hunted down and slain to the last battle brother by the grey-armoured ghosts of the Carcharodons. And now that there was blood in the void, the intensity of their pursuit only increased. After the last green-armoured battle brother fell on Endymion Prime, the Carcharodons returned to their warships, ignoring the angry hails and shouted curses of the fire angels, and set out to the next world, and then the next, and then the next, and then the next, and visited the fates of Iblis and Endymion upon each and every single one of them. The worlds of Gestalt and Laragator are but two amongst the dozens of planets that they burned, pillaged, and destroyed. Not merely raiding, not merely stealing, thieving, or burning from orbit, but systematic obliteration of everything required for the human populace to continue to simply exist. And the Mantis warriors, unable to stand by and watch the destruction unfold, tried with all their remaining might desperately to stop them, launching lightning strikes upon their supply convoys, and they were simply ignored as the Carcharodons took whatever they needed from the civilian populace of the worlds they ravaged. As the Mantis warriors tried to engage them in the void as on the planets themselves, the result was always the same. Severe initial casualties for the Carcharodons, but they would simply keep coming, latching on to the Mantis warriors and refusing to let them go until a hefty price in blood had been paid in every engagement. The Mantis warriors chapter was an expert duelist of incomparable swiftness and precision, used to defeat their enemies in detail, death by 1,000 cuts. But now their rapier was stuck deep, lodged within the muscled abdomen of a shark-headed monster who had them in a death grip and would not let them go until one or the other expired. And the Carcharodons, quite simply, had far more blood to spare. By the end of 910 Millennia 41, the Fire Angels were traveling in the wake of the Carcharodons' fleet, trying to log the extent of the damages and urgently sending messages back to Vengeance Station that humanitarian aid on a massive scale would desperately be required if life was yet to be sustained on dozens of worlds scattered throughout the Endymion cluster. If the aid did not arrive promptly, then all of them would be lost, as their civilian populace would simply find existence impossible in the scattered, burnt out and charred ruins that the Carcharodons left in their wake. Simultaneously, they were also lodging repeated complaints against the grey-armoured Space Marines and their incredible barbarity. Complaints that were received with a heavy heart by Carab Cullen, who could do very little to aid the Fire Angels or the people of the Endymion cluster, as it was now revealed that the savagery of the Carcharodons were not merely an aspect of their own nature, but officially sanctioned actions, taken under the authority of the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition, with the seal of Legate Inquisitor John Dice Frey. This had been the plan all along. This had been the reason why the Carcharodons had been summoned from the outer void to begin with. The Mantis warriors had proven impossible to pin down, They could not be engaged, and all garrison actions taken in the Endymion cluster was met by stiff and unending resistance by the local populace, who believed firmly that their green armored protectors would come to aid them in their hour of need. The legate inquisitor required a chapter so utterly merciless, inhumane, and relentless as to not only be fully willing and capable, but to enjoy the act of laying waste to dozens of worlds, of killing millions, and condemning billions more to death through starvation, exposure, thirst, and all the myriad ways in which a human body can expire in a hostile galaxy. Not to mention the fact that in their rampages, the Carcharodons had torn a hole in the defenses of the warders so wide as to be used as a highway for looters, pillagers, and marauders out of the maelstrom for centuries to come. But the ruthless campaign had achieved its goal. Over the course of innumerable small-scale skirmishes, the Carcharodons had whittled down the remaining humble number of the Mantis warriors to the point that now they were no longer an effective fighting force. It was all the handful of remaining Mantis warriors could do to keep themselves alive, to maintain their dwindling stock of gene seed and hide out in the Endymion cluster. They were no longer a force capable of launching even a raiding action against the Loyalists. Their methods were certainly harsh, but the Carcharodons had achieved what the Sons of Medusa and the Fire Angels could not. The Sons did not really care over much either way. They now had a plethora of near uninhabited worlds to visit for the usual purposes. The Fire Angels, however, were not at all pleased by this sort of strategy, and they requested that Carib Cullen allow them to withdraw from the campaign immediately. Or else. Wishing to avoid potential bloodshed between two still loyalist chapters, Carib Cullen accepted the Fire Angels' request to withdraw, and they pulled out of the Endymion cluster and the BADAB war in its entirety. I'm sure Carib Cullen was not overjoyed to see yet another reasonable chapter withdraw, but it was better than to have a loyalist civil war on his hands. One secessionist foe was plenty, thank you very much. And with the Endymion cluster pacified to the point where local Imperial Guard regiments could take over command, the Carcharodons redeployed, splitting their forces to patrol the Loyalists' rear echelon supply routes, and to free up Red Scorpion and Minotaur forces as well for the preparations of the full invasion of the BADAB sector and the final end to the conflict. With his Adeptus Astartes thusly reorganized and deployed, Carib Cullen was all but ready to launch the final offensive against Lufthuron's stronghold. There was only one minor annoyance that was yet to be dealt with. A massive increase in Corsair activity along the eastern ends of the Maelstrom Zone had been worrying the Lord Militant for quite some time now. They seemed far too well organized and too large in scale to simply be the usual predations of the Maelstrom. The mass warp interference that had, in a way, caused the war to begin with had been subsiding once again, and there was no clear reason why now, of all times, they should be seeing such a massive uptick. Carib Cullen suspected that there were other forces still at play out in the Maelstrom Zone, probably connected to the tyrant himself in some way or another, though a full-scale investigation would have to be launched, and the answers to these questions would have to be gathered before the final battles could commence. And there is where I will leave you today. The fall of the Mantis warriors, somewhat less climactic than the Lamenters. They simply petered out. Their numbers either shaved off in uncountable skirmishes as casualties or captured on a handful of occasions that they were allowed to live. The Fire Angels, of course, returned the Mantis warriors' courtesy and would take them as prisoners whenever possible. But the Carcharodons, well, I hardly need tell you their policy in that regard. Nevertheless, despite their exit from the war being considerably less spectacular than that of the Lamenters, the Mantis warriors had achieved quite possibly even more. They had dragged in the Fire Angels. They had been successfully tying them up and inflicting considerable losses upon them, alongside the Sons of Medusa, though that chapter encountered the Mantis warriors far less frequently for, yet again, self-evident reasons. But they were simply not able to withstand the predations of yet another full-strength chapter. Especially not one against whom the usual lightning strike raid tactics of the Mantis warriors were simply just ineffective. But surely no one can ever claim that the green-armored sons of Jagatai Khan had done anything but make their Primarch proud. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.